Hello guys, in this video I'm going to talk to you about texturing in Photoshop. This video is going to heavily feature textures that are available on the Studio AAA website. The results that you get from what I cover today will depend heavily on the quality of the textures that you're using. Over the years I've created from scratch many textures, like thousands now it'll be, that are on the website. In terms of recent work with textures, this is just some of it. That's just like what I could actually pick up in my hands. There's so much stuff that I've got. You can see like the kisses textures, grunge paper stuff is here, this stuff here. In fact, this texture I'm pretty sure is the one I'm going to use in the video that you might be able to see on screen in a few minutes. I think I'm going to find this one. But yeah, so I've made a lot of textures over the years, and if you are going to follow along the stuff I talk about today, I would recommend going and getting some of the free stuff that's on the site, because you can get free textures that are really high quality on my website, studioAAA.com. But yeah, just wanted to say that at the start of the video, because while obviously I am biased and it might sound like an ad or whatever for the textures, but it is just because they are very high quality. And yeah, let me just get back to where I was. Now I've got all my stuff out. That's going to take forever to put back because it was organized before. Anyway, I think texturing is one of those things that's hard to cover in one tutorial because of how you use a texture really depends on the medium that the texture was created in, what kind of image you're texturing, like what you're working with. I really wanted to primarily make this video a useful resource, so I am just going to cover what options are actually available to you in Photoshop for texturing, so you can be aware of everything that you can do, and then I'm going to go over what I prefer to do and which options are best for the type of image you're working with. This video is not going to be the most fun video, but I think it's useful information to have. For a bit of context, I started writing this script on February 2nd. I'm recording this video on March 18th today, 2024 that is. You can judge by what date this ends up getting uploaded for how long it took to edit and put together like visually on screen. So any support on this video or the texture packs that I mentioned is much appreciated. To cover everything I need to cover for you visually, I'm going to be showing you some demo images that include a texture from grunge paper, which is going to be one of the ones I just dangled and showed you. Grunge paper is an asset pack I made with like some of them that I wasn't able to keep, literally like food compost, ink, food dye, flour, coffee, acrylic paint. I even used ruined a blender at one point. So I put this whole bunch, like stack of paper, like through hell essentially, and scanned it in at, let me check what it's scanned in at actually. So I scanned it in at 10,192 pixels wide by 13,952 pixels high. So the detail is insane. So to follow along with this video, you can go and download any of these texture packs from the Studio AAA website. There are free versions, but obviously, as always, you will benefit from more customization if you have the full pack. I've got some untextured work as well that I'll be working on later in the video. So the most simple way to apply any texture in Photoshop is with a blend mode. Blend modes are split into 6 groups, and you probably can imagine in your head what each of these do, since you've probably like clicked on every single one of them while you've been experimenting and stuff before this video. But from top to bottom, the blend modes are grouped into normal blend modes for the first 2, so normal and dissolve. You've then got darken blend mode, so darken, multiply, color burn, linear burn, and darker color are the darker blend modes. Below that you have the lighten blend mode section, so lighten, screen, color dodge, linear dodge, and lighter color. Bear in mind for later in the video that there are 5 darken blend modes and 5 lighten blend modes, and they are all the exact opposite of each other. I'll go over this later in the video like in more detail, but if you have a really bright image and you use a texture on it with darken and it looks cool, and you wanted to get the same effect on a really dark image, you can usually just swap out the blend modes from darken and lighten. Like you can get the opposite effect essentially, because the 6 darken blend modes are the exact opposite of the 6 lighten blend modes. Anyway, to carry on down the list, after lighten you then have your contrast blend modes, which are overlay, soft light, hard light, vivid light, linear light, pin light, and hard mix. Those are the contrast blend modes. Then you have your, I guess you would call them like inversion blend modes: difference, exclusion, subtract, and divide. And then you would have like your hue, saturation, or I suppose you call them like tonal blend modes. I don't know the like official name for this category, but hue, saturation, color, and luminosity are in the final category, whatever you want to call it. You don't need to understand the computer science or the maths behind each blend mode to use them effectively, but I am going to give you a simple explanation of each blend mode in terms that are like a midpoint between like programmer understanding and what most like graphic design understanding is, I guess. Cue some kind of visual aid that I will create after I have recorded this video. So you have your normal blend mode, which does nothing. When you select normal, it means your layer is displayed as is with no blending. Dissolve blend mode is, according to Adobe's official like documentation, applying a diffusion dither pattern on areas of your layer with partial or full transparency, like around edges, or like if you literally erase and mask out any of the texture and there is like a soft brush area, you know, like if it's like a gradient from full opacity to low opacity, you will see that it becomes very pixely and quite harsh in those areas. The darken blend mode will keep any pixels on your texture layer that are darker than the pixels in the same area on the layer below it. So in other words, the darkest pixels from the layer below the texture that has the darken blend mode will show up. And then multiply blend mode is multiplying the brightness of each pixel in a layer with pixels in the layer below it. So you probably use multiply in your work when you're trying to put emphasis on shadows or darker areas. If you don't understand like the multiplication of pixels in simple terms, and I will say don't worry about like fully understanding it because I don't fully understand it. Every pixel on your image has several number values in the data of your image that kind of determine what is going to be displayed in each pixel and obviously where it's located on the image. So just to give you an example with the color picker here, so hypothetically let's say we are going to create our own custom blend mode called red blue multiply that is going to take red values, which are in this box here, and multiply them by the blue values of the layer beneath. So if you had a pixel that had a red value of 50, which is this dark red color, and you were multiplying that using our like hypothetical blend mode, and there was a pixel below your red 50 pixel that had a blue value of 2, then when we applied the blend mode, the new red value would be 100 red, because you've multiplied your 50 red by 2 to get the output like color of 100 red. Obviously that's like mega simple and there's not much use for that kind of blend mode, which is why it doesn't exist. But yeah, that's when we say multiply, that's what that means. But just to move on, color burn is very similar to multiply, but Photoshop is going to do some extra stuff to keep the saturation in the highlights of the layer below the color burn layer. Linear burn is also very similar because we are still in the darken category, but linear burn is less saturated, like a midpoint between color burn and multiply really. You'll be able to see on screen, I will like generate some previews of this for you just so you can see what I am talking about as I'm talking about it. The last one for the darken category is darker color. Darker color is the same as darken, but it applies itself to what is known as the composite channel, whereas the regular darken actually applies itself to the red, green and blue channels individually before like giving you the output. So when I say composite just means like composed or put together, but in Photoshop terms, because each layer is split into red, green and blue channels, the name that is given to your channel that has all three put together is the composite channel. The main difference between applying something to the color channel separately versus blending onto the composite channel is that when Photoshop blends your texture into the color channels individually, the output is much smoother. So I will right now on screen I'll show the darkened standard one. So this one that you are seeing right now is Photoshop blending the red channel, the green channel and the blue channel separately before giving us our output, and then now I'll change it to the darker color blend mode. So for this one, this preview that it's just changed to now, you are seeing the difference for when it is just blending onto the composite channel. So if you were aiming for like a harsher texture essentially than darken, you can go for darker color. So moving on to the lighten group, obviously lighten, opposite blend mode to darken, it keeps the pixels in the layer if they are lighter lighter than the pixels in the layer below. Screen is the opposite of multiply, so as I said, multiply great for shadows, whereas screen is great for highlights. Color dodge is a more intense and high contrast version of lighten, so you'll find that color dodge will saturate any bright colors that you have in your image because of like added contrast that Photoshop injects in there when it keeps your lighter pixels. Linear dodge is brighter than color dodge, but it's less saturated and a little bit smoother. And then lighter color is the same as what I said before about the composite channel blending. So lighter color is to lighten what darker color is to darken. So lighter color is the lighten blend mode. It's exactly the same, except it is lightening the composite channel rather than the red, green and blue channels individually. So again, lighter color can be like a harsher version of lighten. It's really hard for me to say lighten rather than just say lighten because of my accent, but hopefully I don't sound too stupid. So next is the contrast group, and this is quite complicated, so just bear with me. Now, considering what we've said about the darken and the lighten blend modes being the opposites of each other, keep that in mind because your contrast blend modes are basically combining the darken and lighten blend modes by judging the contrast of each pixel before it blends them. So if you've got a pixel, and let me just come back to Photoshop now and I'll open up my color picker here. In this box where it says B, if I type 100, it's going to go to white. If I type 0, it's going to stay at black. If I type 50, you get what is known as 50% gray. So when I say that Photoshop is going to judge the contrast before it decides how the pixel is going to be blended, the way that Photoshop judges whether your pixel is going to get thrown into a lighten blend mode or a darken blend mode is by comparing it to the 50% gray color. In simple terms, like I'll give you an example. Overlay combines screen and multiply, and what it's doing is if your pixel is above 50% gray, then it's going to blend it using the lighten blend mode, and if your pixel is below 50% gray, it's going to blend it using multiply blend mode. So just so we're on the same page regarding contrast, forget about like what you think contrast is in your image. For the context of this category of blend modes, Photoshop is only judging contrast by comparing the color values of each pixel to 50% gray, and that is it. It's not doing anything else. So if a pixel in your image is brighter than 50% gray, then it applies the assigned lighten blend mode to the contrast group blend mode that you've picked. I know this is getting complicated now, but like it'll make sense when I start explaining each blend mode. Darker than 50% gray, then it applies the assigned darken blend mode to that pixel. And because the lighten and darken blend modes are the exact opposite of each other, every single one has a corresponding like perfect match blend mode for the other, if that makes sense. So as I said before, overlay is combining screen and multiply based on the brightness of each pixel in the layer below compared to 50% gray, because screen and multiply are the exact opposites of each other. Soft light combines screen and multiply based on the brightness of the layer it is applied to rather than the layer below. Hard light combines linear dodge and linear burn. In simple terms, in my opinion, hard light is just a better version of overlay because it is more flexible. Vivid light combines color dodge and color burn. Linear light combines linear dodge and linear burn. Pin light, one of my go-to blend modes, combines lighten and darken. Hard mix is a little bit difficult for me to like explain here because I had an idea in my head like what I thought this was gonna do when I researched it, but I've read 3 or 4 breakdowns of hard mix online that all kind of contradict each other. What I'll say about hard mix is it is the last blend mode in the contrast category, and the last blend mode in the lighten category and the darken category are based on composite channels rather than the RGB channels individually, and your output from hard mix can only display 8 colors. So no matter what you put into hard mix, what you are going to get out of it is going to be 100% made up of red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, yellow and black. So all I know really is that hard mix is going to be doing something with the composite channel and maybe some like dithering stuff similar to the dissolve one, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about hard mix later in the video because it's in another category too, not just the contrast category, but I'll save that for later because we're moving out of the brain melting contrast blend modes now. Difference and exclusion are very similar. Both of them are subtracting the pixels on your texture layer from the pixels on the composite channel of the layer beneath the texture. So the main difference between difference, the blend mode, and exclusion, the blend mode, is that with the difference blend mode, if you blend the same colors, so red and red, then the output will always be black. And with exclusion, if you blend the same two colors, the output will always be gray. Difference and exclusion will also not invert the color black. So if you have two black pixels, they won't cancel each other out, they'll still just remain black. Subtract is very similar visually to difference and exclusion, but it interacts with white differently. So if you have a very dark image and you were using difference and you switch out your dark image to a bright image and you wanted the same effect from the texture, you would just switch to blend mode from difference/exclusion to subtract. Divide again is super similar, but it's interacting with the lighter pixels differently and it can output some more harsh blending than the others. Again, it's not clear to me based on like looking it up, but it tends to be that the last one in each category is harsher because it's using composite channel blending rather than the individual RGB channel blending. It's not like concrete, but I'm guessing that that's what divide is doing as well. The last group, the color/hue tonal group thing that I mentioned before, is very simple. So hue keeps the hue of your texture layer and applies it to the layer below it. Saturation is doing the exact same, but just with the saturation values. Keeps the saturation of your texture layer and applies it to the layer below. Color keeps the color of your texture layer and applies it to the layer below. Remember that while other places use hue and color interchangeably, they are different. So think of it like hue is more relating to the pigment or the shade of a color. Bright green and dark green might be the exact same hue, but they won't be the same color, is kind of the way I would explain it. And finally, we have the last blend mode group that you might not know about because it's not signaled very well in Photoshop, but there are 8 blend modes that have an extra customizable option. Some people have referred to these blend modes as like live effects or interactive blend modes I've seen in other tutorials, but basically color burn, linear burn, color dodge, linear dodge, vivid light, linear light, hard mix, and difference. Is that 8? I think that's all 8. They're kind of in their own group separately because they will react differently depending on the percentage input you put in the fill slider. So for most blend modes, if you turn down the opacity, the blending effects just becomes like less intense. But with the modes that I listed before, if you change the fill strength, you get like a completely different result. You might have noticed if you ever tried this that the blend modes I listed are the ones in this group are like the ugliest blend modes or like the harshest blend modes. You probably never really use them if you've never touched the fill slider. But if you start experimenting with the fill slider, where 100% would be just ridiculous and you would never use it because it's too harsh, 20%, 30% or something in the fill slider, you might get a really nice output. If you want to test it, you can apply any of those blend modes to any image and then just look at what happens when you turn down the opacity versus the fill, and you'll be able to visually understand what's happening yourself. So along with blending modes, you also have blending options and advanced blending. Before I cover that, if you're following along, all I've done is just open just a texture layer, so I'm not doing any texturing yet. I'm just going to show you about blending options and then we'll texture in a minute. So with any layer selected, you can right click and click blending options, or click the FX icon and click blending options, and you will get this little window pop up. Now if you have like an underlying layer, this will be like easier for you to see, but essentially you have this little blend if category section thing here, and you can pull up the black values to cut out like shadows in your texture. So for example, if you were using a darken blend mode and it was a bit too dark, rather than changing blend modes, you could just pull out some of the darker pixels so they were transparent. Same goes if you were using a lighten blend mode and some of the pixels were just too light, you could pull out the highlights. What's even more useful is if you are using one of the contrast blend modes that, like I said, combine a matching opposite lighten and darken. If you hold Alt on your keyboard and click one of these little arrowhead things here, you can split your selection up. So if you wanted to only be blending this little section of grey here and this little section of grey here, bearing in mind that an overlay or a contrast category blend mode is blending your pixels differently based on how they compare to 50% grey, which is in the middle here, you can get really selective with what is blended into your image if you combine the use of the blend if category and the contrast blend modes. This is something you'll become more comfortable with the more you use, basically. You can get some weird results out of it, and if you separate these two and you want to match them back up like I just did, you can just pull them together again and they'll click back together. I don't have an underlying layer, but if you do have an underlying layer, this is just the exact same rules essentially for this little slider below it. It will just not blend. So if you pull this up and you went darken, it now just won't take into account pixels that have this and below basically in them. So moving into the example artwork I've got. So I created this just to demo things for you today. It says graphic design is all about adding 6 textures you found on the internet, which I just tweeted as I was writing this part of like this video script yesterday. So I'm going to pull in 2 textures. I'm going to pull in this lighter paper texture, which is from a pack called Printer Trash from my website. And then I'm going to pull in a darker texture from the same pack and just position them both at the top of my layers palette. For the darker texture, I'm going to go exclusion because that way it's going to apply to both. Oh, I need to mute Photoshop. So yeah, I'm going to apply the exclusion blend mode to the darker texture because that way it's going to apply to both the dark and the light values. And then as I said before, when exclusion is blending a color that is similar, it outputs gray, and my text here is a similar color to this texture, but it was gray before. So if I change this now to difference, because difference outputs similar colors as black, it'll change the text to black, but I want to keep it gray, so I'm going to go exclusion. And then for my lighter texture, I'm going to go pin light, which you might think like straight away looks terrible, and it does, but if I go into blending options and go to underlying layer and just pull in the black value, what my goal is essentially is to just have the white texture come up slightly on the green color I've got. So I pulled the underlying layer slider up to here, and now when I go in on my green, the pin light blend mode is just blending the white and the green essentially now because I've added the blending option. So obviously like this demo is really simple, but now you like know the basics of what you're actually doing rather than just clicking random blend modes. I can keep adding textures. So I've got this texture in Printer Trash, which was like a printer error, so my printer crashed halfway through and I had to like yank the paper out without ripping it, and I scanned it in because it just looks weird. So let's say I want to blend this in somehow. If I go to darken, obviously that's a little bit much, so if we come into blending options now, and again on the underlying layer value, if I just pull things in a little bit on both sides and turn the opacity down, you can start having just some really subtle texturing come through. And then if I let me add one of like the more crazy Printer Trash textures in, like this one. This one's like super high detail. So yeah, if I add one of the crazy ones and I just put that on darker color, obviously immediately like the whole poster is now like not even legible anymore. But if I go into my blending options and change the channels, so remember what I said about how darker color is blending using the composite channel, if I just cut out all the reds, it becomes more legible and it looks like your red ink or your red sections of the paper are now like they've got this cool texture on them that the rest of the page doesn't. Or if I untick green and just leave blue on, or if I just leave green on, through trial and error and all these extra options, you can, so I can add, if I just leave the red channel on and use darker color and then change my blend if on the current layer by pulling the black value up a little bit, my white text now has, I don't know how well this comes across on the recording, so I might just make it a little bit more intense so you can see. Yeah, my white text now has like a very subtle blue tint on it, even though the texture we're using is not blue and it's not subtle. You can still get subtle, nice like color effects and stuff out of stuff that you maybe before you were just writing off that texture because it was too much. If I just wipe those now and turn those off, let me go to different texture pack that I want to show you as well. So if I go to grunge paper and I pull in my favorite texture from that pack, which is grunge paper 58, I'm just going to scale that up and let me put linear burn, I'm going to go for on this one, and then let me just apply like this printer ink texture on top. I'm just going to turn that down a little bit And then I'll just add a curves layer on top, mainly because I don't know how much this is coming across in the video versus like on my screen, because sometimes the screen recording is a little bit hard to make out the details. But yeah, so now I've got my grunge paper set to linear burn. You can see it's mainly affecting the text and the green color. You can make out a lot of the shapes that are from the original texture. In the text sort of segments, it's almost like masked to these letters. So I'm now going to cover another way you can use your texture assets in Photoshop that will contribute to the realism of your effect if you're going for some mixed media work, or if you've got a high detail texture such as the grunge paper one. Just to say as well, so before we went over, for example, how the darken blend modes work, and they're taking the darker pixels from your texture layer and applying them to the underlying layers. If you have a texture you're adding to your work that isn't the highest possible resolution, not only is it going to be unrealistic, but the blend mode you've picked can't work to its full potential because the texture layer has less data than your underlying layers, if that makes sense. Personally, of course I'm biased, but if you care about your work, you're going to want to be using 1200 DPI textures, like the ones I've mentioned, like grunge paper, printed trash, all those ones I pulled in today. Good textures should be easy to blend and be like malleable and let you have plenty of options. So if you're using a texture that is of a lower quality than your design work, effects like the ones I've been covering, like they might not look as good for you. Sometimes when I put out textures, I will also include a displacement map version of the texture file, because if you are blending your textures in the right way, you can also mix in displacement. The good thing is, even when I don't include a displacement map myself, all the texture assets I create are high quality enough that you can just go and make the displacement effect yourself. I'm going to show you how to do that now. So I'm going to duplicate the grunge paper texture I used and change the blend mode to normal, pull it up to the top, and I'm going to go file, save a copy. I will say before you save, it's important that you don't move the texture at all. So if you moved it out a couple of pixels or whatever, just undo and start again. But yeah, save it as a copy somewhere you will remember. The reason I said don't move it is because we're going to displace your text or your underlying image using this layer as the displacement source now. And if you keep your displacement map settings subtle enough, you can line up your texture to your displacement map so that you build up these areas on your image where blending and displacement kind of come together rather than looking like mismatched or whatever. So once you've done that and you've got your copy saved, you can just delete the duplicated texture. Then I'm going to group up everything that I want to be displaced, and I'm going to convert it to a smart object. You can just copy the group if you don't want to, if you want to save all that in the same PSD file. And then I'm going to come up to filter and go to distort, displace. Ideally, you want to be using a texture input that does not require you to crank these settings or have to stretch to fit, because that's where we sort of leave like realism behind. And it just starts looking like a random distortion effect. So I'm going to go 5 and 5, and you can untick the embed box if you are running like low on hard drive space or whatever. Then press OK and just navigate to where you saved your displacement map. So I saved it there. Just click open, and if you went subtle enough, you might be thinking that nothing happened, which is actually a good thing. So if I now zoom in, you will see like the edges of my text, particularly noticeable like here, is now distorted, but it distorts perfectly to line up with the texture because we used the right texture for our displacement source. Might not come again, like I don't know really how much of this comes across super obvious on the video, just as a disclaimer, but now for you this might be too subtle, or maybe it's not subtle enough. Either way, it's unlikely that you got it perfect on the first try. That's fine. You can go and open up the PSD file you just saved. It'll be in your open recent, and once you've opened it, you can flatten your image, discard hidden layers. Now you can start applying things like curves or levels to increase like the harshness essentially of the displacement effect. So if I apply that curves adjustment, and if I'll do a levels as well, and your output will vary depending on this. Now I'm not going to cover the theory behind like the computer sciencey stuff behind displacement in this video, because we went over a lot of blending stuff today already, but if you want a video explaining that, I can do. Essentially the way displacement works is in black and white, so depending on how grey or where they fall on the grey scale, each pixel will react differently to displacement. But yeah, we'll cover that in another video at a later date. But yeah, once you've made any changes, you can just say come back to your original PSD that we were in, and then double click on the displace effect, change any settings that you might want to change. So I'm going to just up mine, let me go like 30 and 30 just so I can make sure I get something that comes out on the screen recording. Choose the same PSD file again, click open. So mine's gone mad, but as you can see, it will line up, me find like an imperfection in the texture. So this here, this like blob that's come through, you can see that, I know this is a really weird way to word it, but the blob is like visible through the displacement. Let me go a little bit more subtle, just so I've got like something nice to export in a minute. So I'm gonna go 10 and 10. This process is a lot of trial and error, but once you get it to where you want to be, it feels good, and you can get some cool effects out of it, like this one, like the mixed media logo type look on there. Honestly, for this one I quite liked it before when I just used the printer textures, so I'm just going to apply those textures I had before. I'll show you what the actual, like I'll put some on screen for the actual effect I got out of this in high quality, so you can see what I got out of the blend modes that I spoke to you about, so you can see the final product. As always, anything I've mentioned in today's video will be linked in the description. I also just want to emphasize that if you support anything on my website, whether it is buying a pack of textures or sharing one of the free downloads or anything like that, really do appreciate it. Just on the subject of textures, like in particular, to name a few people, like Caroline Dietel, Christos.jpg on Instagram, Overset Text on Instagram, Ariaman Munish, Gem Solly or Gempeg on Instagram are all people who regularly use my textures, and literally, whether it's like some personal work that took an hour, or their biggest thing, their most popular post, or like an official commissioned big budget movie poster or merch design or whatever, they always mention that they use my textures and tag me and stuff, which like genuinely makes a huge difference for me. So if you like this video, or me covering topics like in this level of detail, that kind of thing is essentially funded by people who support in that way. So yeah, thank you to those people, and thank you for watching as well. I will see you in the next one.